Okay, great. So thanks, first of all, everyone and organizers for inviting us, everyone for being here, and especially inviting us, Ishan and I, to give this keynote. There are several reasons that we are happy to be the two of us here together, that among the sort of our agenda is very similar, but differently in some ways, so that we can convey nice takeaways from you. There's also some sort of things that relate to the philosophical advices for research that go beyond the topic that I'm also going to be illustrating, and turn to be also incidental on the sort of complementary and substitutability of Ishan's and my research. Okay, that as this is a PhD camp, I think also stressing these aspects can be important for us. So the structure, we're going just to start off the second part that I really just want to build upon the shoulders of what Ishan presented today, that based on this idea that the vulnerability to future climate change, climate risk, concentrate in a very specific subset of the world economy, we're going to think about how the migration interact with this sort of trade channel adaptation and production adaptation in Africa in many settings. From then I'm going to connect it to sort of more technical changes on the way we see this problem, and especially why it's important to eventually change the sort of comparison we want to conduct to answer the question we have in mind, from comparing two future steady states of the world with and without climate change, to account for the dynamics towards this period. We're going to sort of stress why, first of all, this is important, and why then this eventually allow us to study other problems that are under the sort of environmental economics realm, but not necessarily related to agriculture development, such that to say that also the sort of toolbox we've been using to answer questions on this specific set of economics can also be very useful to answer other questions, okay? So to do that, I was also very lucky to have the inspiration by Ishan of structuring his talk in these three topics that I'm going to somehow tweak and change them. Okay, I'm going to first revisit this sort of unfortunate coincidence that Ishan presented, but thinking about the second version where how migration interact to that. Okay, then we're going to revisit again what Ishan presented on this idea of trade as a climate change adaptation, and seeing how migration interacts with this channel. And important here, we're going to really, or I'm going to try to convey clearly here the importance of thinking about migration as an outcome versus thinking about migration as a sort of mitigating channel, right? Because these two dimensions are important, could be important for us to study, and thinking about them carefully, it's also important when we are conveying the sort of normal consequences of our research. I've been, teasing some of you here throughout this talk saying, okay, what is the welfare thing you have in mind, right? What is the output we should be carrying when answering the question? And with migrations, it's sometimes tricky. Some fields think about migration as an outcome. Some fields think about how migration interacts with other outcomes. I'm going to stress this on the climate change adaptation, and then just sort of extrapolating how to use this toolbox for also answering broader questions in environmental economics. Again, with this idea, repeating what Ishan said, that our goal here is sort of to expose you to different sort of papers, different types of research, rather than narrowing too much on what we've been doing, to stimulate ideas, stimulate discussions, stimulate new projects. Okay, good. So starting with this second version of this unfortunate coincidence in terms of exposure to climate change, what Ishan was very precise in explaining is these three dimensions that make societies, parts of the world economy very vulnerable to climate change, relate to income, the temperature they are, and the degree of sector specialization in agriculture. This turn out to be very concentrated in the regions in the world that are expected to suffer more from global warming. Okay, the thing is that my second tuned up version of this unfortunate coincidence is that these countries, these regions, absent of climate change, have also been regions that are being through a fast process of structural change and rural to urban migration. Okay, this is regardless of climate change. Okay, and the first sort of question when we think about this, and John somehow touched upon this point, is that this relationship between migration and structural change, this idea of factors moving out of agriculture, perhaps geographically reallocating within countries or across countries, the normative question around there, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? It is just simply part of how societies work. And if we look back on past on how structural change happened in Europe, in the United States, that fostered one specific development process, are we expected this same sort of process to happen in the low-income rural economies of nowadays? And very often the answer is no. First of all, because the structural change process that is happening in these economies are not as such as what happened a century ago, such that many cities that are receiving large flows of rural to urban migrants, they are sort of jobless cities. There are many papers talking about industrialization without jobs, or jobless industrialization, or structural change without the industry moving directly to sectors as services, etc., etc. Okay, so there are some very specific aspects of how migration operates in these low-income settings, okay, that one needs to sort of understand to then think about how climate change is going to interact with this or vice versa. Robin.
So what, the one big fact you don't have here is rising population.
Oh, yes.
So the red areas of Ishan's graph are, I think, the only areas that are going to have dramatic increases in population.
Absolutely.
So because it's slightly weird, you're saying risk is increasing, but so is population.
Absolutely. Well taken point. It's something I mislooked it. I completely agree with you. Something that will even add to this unfortunate coincidence. It's true that most processes are interlinked to one another. It's also that these are the regions of the world where the demographic curve is still very steep, right? So population is growing a lot in these places, which could exacerbate the food problem and the interaction with climate change. But also, as I guess where you after, also interact with this process of rural to urban migration and structural change.
I mean, it's also falling. Population will be falling after the middle of this century, and many other areas
Yes.
that are not red. So
Yes, I agree. And on the other hand, what Robin says that there's another region of the planet where the demographic curve is precisely on the other side, right? The population is decreasing. And then there's this obvious idea of international migration flows also being part of the story that we'll discuss in a few slides, also interacting with this. Thanks for raising this, Robin. This is a good one. Okay, so here just a quick parenthesis then, so that I just wanted to, in 2 slides, highlight more or less what are the sort of 2 important aspects of how migration operates in these low-income economies, thinking about, again, climate change here, climate risk here, being a potential negative shock to the sector these economies are specialized in, agriculture. Okay, so migration literature, regardless of climate change for a moment, is that it's seeing something that it sees rural to urban migration as something, in general, something that is good. Okay, in the sense that it is a sort of technology, it's something that allows rural communities to cope with either changes in the structure of the economy or even to short-term shocks, such that can just overcome this sort of productivity shocks in agriculture. Okay, so there are several papers here that says, first of all, that this is a profitable thing, but it's underutilized for all sorts of frictions, barriers in the economy that make sense that they exist. For instance, there are either liquidity or risk constraints to people to migrate, informational constraints that people do not know, they are not aware of the gains they will realize if migrating to overcome the changes the society they're facing, okay? Barriers to migration create very large misallocation of where people are in space. This paper by Garrett and Melanie were very inspiring for me during the PhD in Indonesia, showing precisely this, that, you know, there's really this misallocation of people. They rationalize with migration barriers, or here this paper is in Bangladesh, if not wrong, rationalizing this with the idea of, you know, literally constraints because migration is costly, okay? So it's a key development margin to interact with this process of structural transformation, yet in these countries, it's underexploited due to these barriers, okay? There is also 2 other very nice papers that really think about more, rather than migration, a sort of long-term process, but temporary migration as something that allows, you know, societies, villages, households to cope with temporary shocks, and think about temporary migration to send remittances, etc., as this sort of risk coping mechanism that, again, it's subject to many sort of barriers, either local institution, the risk, liquidity constraints that do not permit individuals to resort to this technology. Why is this relevant? Because now that we're going to move back into the sort of climate change effects and the role of migration, the sort of stepping point that we're going to start with is this idea that migration can be one way of individuals to cope with the climate shocks that these economies are going to suffer, yet in the presence of barriers, this could eventually amplify the losses in the welfare, whatever welfare we measure with an interest. Okay? Very good. So how then I started thinking about this. This is somehow another parenthesis is almost the history of economic thought of Bruno on getting into my research in the past years, how I got into seeing this problem the way I see nowadays, okay? I started from this project, this paper by Vernon Henderson and co-authors that really just think about, from a very empirical perspective, what will be or what has been already the consequences of climate change in urbanization and migration in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, there is this graph that is just showing here redder colors, the locations that are becoming drier. So we should interpret those as the locations experience this negative productivity shock to agriculture. Okay, and then what they are studying is the relationship of this with urbanization rates that happen across cities in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, I'm obviously going to skip all of the details what this paper is doing. It's very data rich, especially for the period when it was written, okay? But what they find actually that is very interesting is that this negative shock negative productivity shock around cities, what happens is that this generates urbanization, increasing urbanization rates, namely that there is inflow of people into these cities, but only to the cities that actually are specialized in non-agricultural sectors. Okay, actually, what these authors found that initially, I'm sure they were very surprised when ran this first regression. Okay, this regression is the climate shock. Okay, on urbanization rates, they ran this regression and got a negative sign. Said, okay, how is it possible? A negative shock to agriculture is also decreasing urbanization rates and population levels in cities. How is this possible? The idea is precisely splitting this into cities that are really cities that provide services to agriculture, such that in the hinterlands, there was a negative shock. These are just non-tradable goods that they suffer indirectly this shock. And those cities that are exposed to international markets that export and import goods, those actually experience an increase in population. Okay, so this is the first sort of dimension where we see the degree of exposure, depending on the sector specialized on, really interact on the way that climate shocks is going to channel into the outcome we are interested in.
Don't they still experience a decrease? It's just less severe.
Sorry?
Am I reading this wrong? Is it they still experience a decrease, it's just less severe?
Well, the average effect is negative.
Yeah.
Because most of the cities are specialized in providing services to agriculture. So there is a very few set of cities that are those sort of modern industry cities. But overall, the average effect across Africa, you're right, is negative. And these are on rates and comparing obviously cities whose hinterlands have not been affected. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I must be misreading the table. Don't worry.
Sure. Okay. So then putting this out of Africa to a sort of more broader setting, there is a very rich literature here on climate migration. I'm not going over to a very big extent, but there is this paper by Cristina Cattaneo and Giovanni Perri on international migration. So then zooming out of within country choices, but across countries, and literally showing that bilateral migration flows also show this idea that climate shocks, read as lower productivity shocks, do push migration out of countries that are specialized in agriculture. And importantly, those that are extremely poor, actually this response, conditional on being specialized in agriculture, it's slower, interpreted by this idea of that it's very costly to people to migrate. They get trapped into these locations. Get this word of populations being trapped there, because this is going to be a concept I'm coming later on. And on the context of the temporary migration, many studies, including this paper on Vietnam, showing this idea that internal migration, temporary migration as a cushion to cope with short-term shocks. Do you want to ask something?
Yeah, I was wondering, in the models, how are people thinking about measuring welfare impacts? Because on one hand, for people who move, it's potentially welfare improving, but the impacts on like origins, where you have fewer people now, it could be negative depending on sort of agglomeration. So like,
excellent point. We're going back to this, okay? But ultimately, a short answer to your question is really then depending on how we sort of set which is the welfare outcome we are interested in. Okay, so in most of the spatial models, people here that have some experience with this, we write welfare as a bundle of how much we can consume and eventually any non-monetary amenities that map into utils, right? And then eventually these amenities are subject to congestion, agglomeration forces, right? So ultimately this is going to be the welfare that can be decomposed in these two sort of dimensions. But obviously then in a setting with bilateral migration choices, people always make optimal decisions in those models, right? So they're going to the locations where they're best off, but obviously those left behind will be worse off. And one of the peers I'm going to touch upon is going to provide evidence of that. Okay, we're going back. Thank you. Very good. So yes, that's pretty much it in sort of thinking about then how we think about migration, interacting with climate change, climate shocks, and the process of structural change. Okay, but then when we think then about now with this sort of more empirical evidence looking backwards, and now we care about the future, eventually, how this process of migration is going to interact with the adaptation of the economy to the climate change, then this is obviously where the process, we need to combine this empirical evidence with a model that generically model can tell about what are going to be the outcomes in the future, where all the general equilibrium forces are going to interact with the climate shock and yield the outcomes which are intercept. Okay, and here's going to be the first sort of philosophical parenthesis, a technical pause I want to make, which is something that happened in my research sort of career that I wanted to share with you. Okay, this comment here for me, it really illustrates, for instance, in this case, why I needed a model at the first place. Okay, I remember I was a PhD student. I was saying, you know, especially quantitative trade papers around, you know, the papers were always structured. Okay, there is this data that is super cool. There's those motivating facts that are super nice. And there is a super complicated model that we do the structural estimated model, and then we run counterfactuals for welfare effects, et cetera, et cetera. And then very often I say, okay, but why are we using this sort of step-by-step toolbox? Okay, so I learned that actually, or at least what I would advise for us is just to think about the methods. Do we need the data and empirical facts? Do we need the model? The answer is that depending on our research question. Okay, so the tools we use, my advice is that it should fit the research question and not vice versa. It's the question that drives the tools and not vice versa. Okay, now you ask me, okay, Bruno, so why you need a model for this? Just as an example, right? We want to know about future outcomes. Can we just extrapolate these reduced form trends we get from past data into the future when many things are going to adapt over time and general equilibrium effects? Can we just extrapolate that? No, we need a model, right? So that's why we decided to come with this, okay? There is one nice model on climate migration that does not cover many important dimensions, but do cover some other important dimensions. If you're interested in climate migration itself, this is the paper to start from, okay? But then I just moved to then what was the sort of project that I started working with and indirectly interacting with Ishan to answer this question. How then this sort of migration channel is going to interact with climate damages and adaptation in these regions that are developing regions in the world. Okay? Or differently, how the migration channel is going to interact with this trade and climate adaptation migration. Okay? So, second parenthesis here, philosophical aspects on research, it is that when I started writing this project, if I have to say in one phrase, what is this paper about, I would say there is a combination of the CDS paper that Ishan presented, this multi-crop dimensionality of climate shock, together with Ishan's paper on the importance of sectoral specialization and structural changes, normothetic behavior of preferences, how these interact with migration. Okay, one thing that happened in my experience was the following. You know, I was, 2-3 years before the market, I was hearing about those guys doing different things. And then we start getting really stressed about our research looking like really similar to one another. Okay. And then one thing that was very good for me was actually to interact with these people, be open about this, and find a way that our research become very complementary. Okay. And, I remember hearing or even receiving advice from some people that to tell me to go actually on the competitive direction and say, you know what, no, you should work really hard and be the first one, to be ahead before this person. And actually it was something, this is one sample point, is me, okay? I would advise against, okay, actually being collaborative, interacting with people, even overseas in other universities that are doing things very similar to you, can be in the short run, but also in the medium longer run, very profitable research-wise, not to say also personal-wise, to have a nice relationship with people. Okay, so another parenthesis that I just wanted to close here. Great. The point of this paper is going to be the following. We're going to have climate as a heterogeneous shock to agriculture is going to interact with migration and sector allocation, these two channels, subject, and this is the important ingredient, trade and migration barriers to adaptation. Okay. Now, there's some sort of results I just summarized here, but it just connects to some questions raised. First of all, this future projections then predict there are millions of migrants across sub-Saharan Africa. That maps into the welfare outcome, that is this classic amenity times consumption that individuals enjoy, but very heterogeneous. Okay, there's going to be a few winners and several losers of this process. Okay, and we're also going to feature this food problem in climate adaptation. There's going to be agricultural employment increasing in many countries because these countries are trapped in terms of not being able to import food from other countries. Okay, now the thing that then I'm going to show is that then how policy experiments illustrate the interaction of trade as one margin of adaptation, migration as one margin adaptation of the two of them together. Okay, I'm going to summarize everything in one table. Okay, that here just shows, first of all, the sort of baseline results. We build this complicated model for the end of the century. It says, okay, with climate change, there's going to be about 17 more million people, okay, out of which 5 internal migrants. But the sort of outcome we are after, if we think about welfare, the distribution of combination of amenities and income, welfare effects of climate change is about, on aggregate in Africa, 3% smaller. And also, if you only focus on the income part, it's on the same magnitude. And here, the non-agricultural employment decreases, right? So there's more people working in agriculture. And distributional-wise, across countries, you see that these results are extremely, extremely heterogeneous, right? There are several losers that lose by a lot. Some countries lose up to 30% of their welfare, and some very small winners that gain a lot. And that's why aggregated results are not these small aggregate results hide a large degree of heterogeneity. Okay, what is nice, what I want actually to use this table for is to compare, to show to you how then relaxing migration barriers or relaxing trade barriers illustrate the importance of these channels in adaptation. Okay, if you only relax migration barriers, not completely eliminate those barriers, this is a bit realistic. Okay, but if you relax barriers in Africa such that it mimics more or less the degree of bilateral country barriers in the European Union, we see that obviously there is more migration. Surprisingly, actually, welfare effects do not change much, either on aggregate and also on distributional aspects. What is the reason for that? It's true that many people are able to live and go to other countries and are better off. But what happens is that those left behind, they are as worse off as before. And because migration is costly, what happens is that those are just stuck there. And they are stuck in a very unproductive country. They are stuck on work in agriculture because they need food, right? They need a subsistence good. So that actually, it's not very efficient in dealing with this sort of distribution aspects of the welfare effects of climate change. Now, if we turn into the relaxing trade barriers instead, the picture is completely different, okay? We see that it reduces migration massively. Why? Now, locations that eventually could change the pattern of production towards other crops, but they were really stuck because of trade barriers. They could not export or import other crops. Now, when we relax trade barriers, this is not the case. So less people need to migrate, but especially the distributional bands here of the welfare effects decrease immensely, right? So this is the idea that now people can trade with one another, the CDS channel, the crop specialization to trade, allow to reduce the inequalities in the climate change effects. And the two of them together has a sort of combination of effects that is also very subject to congestion externalities. There are externalities in this model that make also the outcome inefficient, okay? That actually, for the interest of time, I'm going to skip the part on the externalities, okay? Good. Now, the thing is that it is going to link to the part of the thinking about dynamics is that this exercise, as with the exercise discussed before by Ishan, we are thinking about a sort of static, steady state of the economy in the end of the century and comparing these two steady states, right? But over time, climate change is a sort of gradual project that is gradually happening. And throughout this process, there are several sort of intertemporal choices and externalities effects compound over time that actually using dynamic settings frameworks are more suitable for that. We can really account for this gradual adaptation as climate change effects slowly take place, okay? Now, for that then, just to show like the one first study that looks at this with some detail is thinking now about climate change, not as a productivity shock to agriculture, but thinking about coastal flooding and the problem of climate change being just a shock to land available in coastal regions in the planet, okay? through this sort of dynamic spatial models, what would happen is that coastal flooding then increase land prices and eventually will push economic activity to other places in the absence of barriers, right? If the economy can gradually adjust to that, okay? And the bottom line of this paper, and I'm going to show you two graphs that are just going to show them graphically, is this, that shutting down either the endogenous productivity process and endogenous migration reaction to coastal flooding magnifies losses immensely, okay? If we allow individuals to gradually adapt to it, actually the losses of this process shouldn't be as large, okay? We see that visually here. This is just one map showing the results of this paper that are somehow obvious. Red dots are the regions that are going to suffer the larger welfare losses from coastal flooding. Obviously, they are the coastal regions, the most exposed to coastal flooding. Great. What is the nice takeaway of this project is that if we see over time, x-axis, the changes in the percentage, two different measures of welfare, either real GDP or welfare that accounts for the migration utility costs and amenities, we see that the baseline evolution of welfare changes with coastal flooding is not as large as if we also shut down either the migration aspect, if we keep migration fixed, or if we don't allow innovation to sort of reduce the negative shock from coastal flooding of the two of them together. This difference here is showing in the long run what is the importance of these margins into gradually adapt into this process of climate change shock. And we see that it's also very nonlinear, right? And that's the importance of this dynamic framework that gradually accounts for this as this builds up over time, okay? Then there is another project that then sort of revisits what Ishan and I have discussed, that it is this importance, interaction between trade as a margin of adaptation and migration in a global setting, okay? Then it's another sort of dynamic spatial model. This was one project I wrote during the PhD with Klaus Desmet and others as co-authors, okay? With Esteban and my PhD advisor, that we also think about a framework in which the economy gradually evolves over time, the spatial economy evolves over time, but importantly, the economy is interconnected with the climate, okay? The economy generates emissions that increase temperatures, maps back into the economy as a damage function, a negative productivity shock that's going to affect future economic decisions, future emissions. So the two things co-evolve. We call this a fancy name, spatial integrated assessment model, okay? And what we learn with that in this setting that is spatial and multi-sector, such that factors can move across space over time, there is migration, as well as a multi-sector that over time, the degree of sector specialization, where different activities are going to happen over time, will also interact with the process of endogenous climate. This is going to show a substitute aspect of adaptation between trade and migration. If we can adapt to trade, there's going to be less migration, and if not, more migration. This is a bit straightforward, but we can show that quantitatively. Okay, this is just three maps that illustrate the point. This is just one map showing the baseline results of economy with climate change at the end, very end, 200 years down the line. Bluer colors, locations that are going to have in percentage points more population, okay? And we see the obvious thing that over time, there's going to be this gradual move out of very hot locations into higher latitudes, okay? This is percentage points, okay? So that's why, you know, very, very north, it's very blue. It's not that it's going to become massively populated. It's just because we're starting from very little population, okay? But this is just sort of positive, descriptive, sort of what could happen in the future. Great. What will happen then if we increase barriers of trade in this economy? Okay, this map is showing the difference of the population in the two scenarios with higher trade barriers versus a scenario with very low trade barriers in the world. Okay, so what we see here is that with higher trade barriers, there's even a larger push of people towards, you know, we see Europe and the United States from these regions that are affected because trade is limiting them to adapt through sectoral specialization. So the only thing left for them to do is to migrate as an adaptation choice.
You said migration and trade are substitutes in adaptation.
Sure.
Then why is it important to have both of them in the model?
No, more than having them, actually, to get into this conclusion, we had these two things in the model, in our story, and then with these exercises, we actually conclude that they end up being substitutes. So it was not an assumption that we made.
Actually, until we don't know.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Actually, this is what I'm kind of trying to convey here, right? The differences between the two graphs is this: when we increase trade barriers, so there is less scope for adapting to sector specialization and trade, we have more migration, right? And actually, there is this sort of differences in differences that convey the same idea, but the idea is precisely this: how we get into this conclusion. Okay. Now, there's also this other map that I'm going to skip, but just gives the idea of sectoral specialization. That I was just showing population when they are sorting, but there's also the comparison of these two here, show bluer colors, the locations that are going to be more specialized in agriculture, the sectors that are more affected, if trade barriers are very high and trade barriers are very low. With very low trade barriers, there is a higher degree of concentration of where agricultural activity is could be in the future. That is very different if trade barriers are very high, such that then obviously economic activity has to spread across space. Okay, but this just to show the sort of multi-sectoral dimension of those results. There are other papers in this literature. Okay, that for instance, this recent working paper by Adrian Bilal with Esteban Rossi Hasberg, they really think about this anticipation of climate shocks from the perspective of capitalists. You know, that climate change also through extreme natural events affect the physical capital and the process of capital accumulation. Okay, there is also this paper of Jose Luis that think about these spatial integrated models with multi-sector economy, how that the food problem amplifies labor reallocation across space, and Ivan Rudik on the importance of input-output channels. Okay, each of these papers try to study different margins within the same problem. Okay, but what I wanted then to convey, great, in the final 5 to 7 minutes, it is the point of how we can use this sort of toolbox that I didn't get into the technicalities, but the conceptual, this idea that we have the spatial economy dynamically evolve over time, how this toolbox can be useful for us, or better than useful, can be needed to answer questions that belong to the environmental economics realm, sort of away, not necessarily within the sort of trade and agricultural subset of the economy. Okay, so again, why we sort of need dynamics, why we need a dynamic model to think about the future, etc. First of all, climate change, again, being a bit redundant, is a slow process, a slow-moving thing. The economy and the climate co-evolve gradually, okay? And also affects how these externalities, the present in the economy, compound over time, okay? And then there are several other spatial problems that then would require a dynamic approach if you want to study and answer questions within them, okay? A few of them that I want to highlight, and then I have some details in these two type of projects are, for instance, and this is then my opinion on sort of topics that I think are also very important nowadays, okay? First of them relates somehow to resource economics, okay? We think about global warming, climate change happening, it really because we need fossil fuels to produce energy, but at the same time, there is a renewable energy process going on the background, okay? So how then fossil fuels that could be gradually depleted interact with the transition to renewables and climate policies dynamically over time, okay? There is also this problem on physical infrastructure, installed capital that is really installed and fixed in some regions. The coastal regions are going to be the example for obvious reasons, but there are many, okay? And there is this nature of this capital that is just fixed there, and the slow-moving nature of climate change. It generates this sort of intertemporal mismatch in incentives, right? I'm going to discuss, Claire, I'm sorry, your paper here. We see it in Vietnam, right? There is all of these roads in regions that are expected to be flooded, okay? What is the obvious response is to relocate those roads, but this is a fixed capital investment that is there, right? And it's very costly to rebuild this. And meanwhile, you know, the sea level is rising very, very slowly, and then this generates this sort of mismatch of exposure of infrastructure to future climate risk, okay, and in other settings. There is also the thing that many policies and responses to climate change are distorted spatially, usually because of political, okay? Very often post-disaster aid can have negative consequences or can sort of backfire if subject to political cycles, for instance. And again, on the idea of resource economics, there are many other things within environmental economics, not necessarily the quality of our atmosphere, global warming, but the quality of our forest, availability of water, that in the globalized economy with spatial linkages across the planet, it's also important for us, okay? So one paper here very quickly, this paper on the economic geography of global warming by Jose Luis Cruz and Esteban Rossi Hasberg, they have this idea that it's again going to be this dynamic spatial model. It co-evolves with the climate, but there is this endogenous choice of energy being produced with either clean energy or fossil fuels. Fossil fuels being in principle, this is an assumption, in principle finite. Okay, so the point sort of is that if Saudi Arabia is full of fossil fuels nowadays, it runs out of oil, what is going to happen? Is it going to transition to, you know, like renewable sectors, or simply economic activity today is in Saudi Arabia is going somewhere else? Okay, how then abatement subsidies, climate policies, carbon tax, for instance, interact with this process? Okay, there is just one graph that I'm just going to go here to convey the takeaway, that is the following. Okay, be with me here. We have this graph that on the horizontal axis have the timeline of the simulation results of this model, and in the horizontal axis, the changes in percentage points in two outcomes: the level of emissions over time and the associated temperatures worldwide that the world will face under these patterns of emissions, of fossil fuel extractions and emissions. Okay, this has, first of all, a U-shaped relationship. Why? Because we are assuming in this model that we're going to run out of fossil fuels, and then we're going to then transition to cleaner energies. Okay, what this paper is showing is that if we do different simulations with different policy settings, if we put a global carbon tax of 50%, 100%, and 200%, what happens is that we can't prevent all of the oil to be extracted. The oil is going to be extracted. It only delays this extraction. It only flattens this emission curve. But without abatement, without innovation in the clean sector, we're going to end up burning all of the oil that we have either way. Okay, in terms of the consequences of global temperature is going to be the same. It is only going to be delayed. Okay, so it's the interaction of innovation in abatement technologies with climate policy, carbon taxes, that can be more efficient into reducing global temperatures in the long run. Okay. Other projects that I touched upon, this idea of the welfare gains from transportation investments. Transportation investments here are the road upgrades in Vietnam that happened in the first decade of the century, and bluer regions where they're exposed to sea level rise in the future. Okay, the point of the paper is that two things, again, this step by step, do we need a model, do we don't, etc., etc. First, we want to assess what are the net present value, the welfare gains if we construct an infrastructure, a big infrastructure investment such that these road upgrades. Just to understand them, we have this design, this spatial model that really can account for the effects of this infrastructure investment, and then compare what will be the outcomes if we account for the fact that many of these regions, actually were constructed regions in the future, are not going to be available because of sea level rise. If we account for that, the net present value of this is going to be much lower, right? This is a sort of myopic investment once made, and now is really just sunk there, literally, right? It's just a sunk investment that are in a very hazardous range. This interacts very often also with political and strategic behavior of agents. This paper by Alan Gisiao on sea level rise in Jakarta precisely shows this, that in Jakarta is a city that is very populated, okay? It's also subject to sea level rise risk, okay? And the thing is that already several years ago, the government there started reacting to that by constructing seawalls in regions that are very risky to that perspective, okay? What happens is, the point of the paper is that generates moral hazard in the sense that there is more real estate development precisely in these regions that are risky, in the regions that were protected. And the argument here, the mechanism that is being studied, and that requires a model with moral hazard and endogenous reaction of real estate developers, is this idea that real estate developers know that once they construct a very fancy building in front of the line ocean, it's going to be a very costly, valuable asset that is going to be there that the government is going to protect in the future. And then what Alan shows is that if the government can commit to what's going to be the places that are going to be protected or not, such that the real estate developers cannot react to that, the net present value in the future, in the end of the 2200th century, is going to be much larger. But if the government cannot commit to that, and there is room for moral hazard, actually net present value is much lower. Okay? Very good. I guess that was it. That was what I had to discuss today. There are just some other papers in interesting topics that I really like that relate to this sort of aspects on the political cycles and political distortion of post-disaster aid, the relationship with water and deforestation, that I just leave it here for your reference. Okay. Now open to you and to discussion. Thank you.
2 minutes.
We just take like a couple questions and then people can come chat with us.
Exactly. You said that we have 2 minutes, right? In principle, according to the schedule, right? Whatever you guys prefer. You can just come to us and chat if you want, however you prefer. Anyone, any questions? The first brave in the room?
I guess I'm interested in sort of some of these longer term models, the role of conflict or civil war that sort of gets created by climate change, but then also prevents internal migration and destroys capital as well. Like, is there something in the literature thinking about like longer term effects of conflict and then the effects on adaptation?
This is something that is on the agenda, in the sense that there are some papers, I can give you the references, that really think about the geography of conflict, right? That migration being either an outcome or a cause of conflict in settings, especially sub-Saharan Africa. And there are some papers on that. And it will be very interesting to understand the interaction of climate change, either as a push factor of migration and eventually causing more conflict, or vice versa. Right, climate change causing conflict because of the dispute of limited resources, and as a consequence pushing people in terms of migration flow. This is an interesting topic to be studied.